about South Africa is like people are not afraid to put stuff onto social media that comes from dark places in their hearts. And by that I mean there was some pretty terrible stuff that was written on my Facebook page about me and about what this photo represented and about everything that comes with that. It's still up, by the way. You can go and look at it if you want. So it was scary. I'm not going to lie. It was kind of scary because I'm not even South African, right? So to put my foot in the middle of this huge debate on race and land and really politics was a tough place to be in. Basically what I want to do tonight, and I'm so happy that you guys are all here, so thanks for coming, is talk about my history using drones and other forms of technology to kind of uncover these hidden architectures in the world that we live in and people's lived experiences because of those architectures. Okay. How many of you have been to Cape Town? One person. Two people. Really? If I do this talk in Europe, especially in Germany, everyone's hand goes up. But I guess it's a little too far for an American plane ticket. It's quite a long ways there. I've lived there for 7 years now. And this is Cape Town. It's probably the most beautiful city on earth. I don't think that's hyperbole. Look at that. And this was the image when I first moved to Cape Town that I realized everyone was sort of sharing and selling and inspired by. Now remember, I'm a photographer, so I have a small photography business. 7 years ago, I went there to get a master's degree and to pursue my photography business. This was the image, and this is the image that kind of sums up Cape Town, right? It's taken from a helicopter normally, but I had this idea that why don't I use this new technology, this is 3.5 years ago now, called drones. No one had one in Cape Town at that time, very few people, and take this photo for myself. So I went back to Seattle, which is my hometown, and I bought a drone. This is a DJI-inspired drone. Maybe you guys have drones, I don't know. Does anyone fly drones in the audience? A few people, I figured. So this drone is still a good drone. 3 years ago, it was a very good drone, and I was kind of the only person in Cape Town that was flying it. And I learned, and I brought it back, and my idea was not to be looking at these hidden architecture issues. It was literally just to take that first photo. So it started off with kind of a very sort of banal premise for why I bought the drone. And this is Table Mountain. So this is the very famous mountain that's right behind Cape Town. And I wanted to sort of learn. I wanted to take that photo that I showed you at first, but I also wanted to learn by taking sort of cool hiking videos. So I'm going to show you the very first video I ever shot. It's very short with the drone. This is just a snippet of it. This is called Kloof Corner, which is the corner that you're looking at there. Okay, if that doesn't make you want to go to Cape Town, I don't know what else I could do. So that video, I showed it to my friend. I put it on YouTube and I showed it to my friend. And he said, and if you're from Cape Town, like if you grew up in Cape Town, you always know what Table Mountain looks like. It's got this silhouette with the 3 peaks, and people have it on their bumper stickers. They have tattoos of it. That's not hyperbole. Like people have tattoos of the 3 peaks. So everyone knows exactly what Table Mountain looks like. And my friend that I showed that video to said, wow, I've never seen Table Mountain look like that before. And that to me was that aha moment, that light bulb moment, maybe some of you have had it as well, where I realized that drones weren't just a gimmick. It was actually this completely revolutionary technology that allowed people to sort of show the world in a new way to people and for them to consume the world in a new way. So that might sound trite now, but like 3 years ago, it was quite a revolution. And it sparked this idea of mine that because Cape Town was such a divided city because of apartheid and because of colonialism, I wanted to see, and I was studying that at UCT, University of Cape Town, I wanted to see how that drone technology applied to that particular phenomenon. So this is just a little background. If you've never been to Cape Town, which many of you haven't, Cape Town during apartheid, so that was the period from like 1956 or so to 1994, was extremely divided. There was a lot of forced removals that happened, and even before apartheid happened, black Africans were generally treated as sort of the help or labor writ large, if I can say that. So they had to have a pass to move around, they had to live in certain areas, and this is the census taken in 2011. You can see, for example, those 3 neighborhoods. They're different colors because that's the predominant racial group that lives there. The purple is white, and then the blue is black, and then the yellow is a South African racial classification called colored, which refers to kind of like a mixed race, but it's not necessarily black with white. It's kind of a little bit more complex than that, but we don't really have time to go into it. But for example, Trevor Noah refers to himself as colored, but I think his mom was black African and his dad was from Switzerland. In Cape Town, it's usually a mix of like descended slaves from Malaysia and India and the Khoisan people who were originally in that area. So that's kind of a digression, but just so you know, they were all separate during apartheid, and they had separate types of preferences, like where they could move and where they could live. And look at this now. In 2011, people still live there. So this idea of persistence based on infrastructure, because look at the highways that surround, for example, that blue block. And the further down that blue block that says Nyanga, right there. So that big open space is the airport. There's huge pieces of infrastructure that divided people. The apartheid government was extremely, extremely efficient at keeping people separate. So if you go to Cape Town today, you'll see there's 4-lane highways, or there's green belts, or there's airports, or there's power stations separating racial groups, even to this day. So that's why I think Cape Town really struggles with this idea of being a divided city. And I wanted to kind of put the drone right over one of those divides. So I went to one of these spots. This is a dot map of South Africa created by a guy. It's basically a data tool based on that census data. And this area is called Masiphumelele. So in this particular slide here, the green is black Africans, and then the purple is white Africans. And I actually surf nearby here. So every day when I went to go surfing, I would drive past this township, and it always struck me as really weird. I mean, look how dense and homogenous that place is compared to the surrounding area, which is all vineyards, actually. So it's like the quintessential sort of rich person's landscape of vineyards and golf courses. But in Cape Town, again, because of the crime issues, everyone lives behind these big gated fences and sort of electric fences in general. So it's really difficult to sort of see your neighbors just in general. Again, an example of how the built environment constrains and changes people's experiences of how they live. So this was the cul-de-sac that I drove to. This is Google Street View, but this is what it looked like. And I pulled my car up right there, and I put the drone on the ground and flew up into the air. And this is the video that came out from that. So I'll just describe what you're seeing. This is the township on the left. It's called Masiphumelele. If you can't read that, there's about now 45,000 people that live there. And then just on the other side of this wetlands is a gated community called Lake Michelle. And it's a proper gated community with guardhouses and electric fences that surround the whole place. And the image that I took was that image. And so you can see here we don't have Zillow, but we have other sort of tools like that in South Africa. The property values of those houses are about 3-4 million rand each, more or less, which is like, at the time, maybe $300,000, which is a lot of money in South Africa. And then the other side is what, if you're in South Africa, you'd refer to as a township. There's actually formal areas. So you can see the red roofs are actually formal houses. The government, by constitutional decree, promises everyone a house in South Africa. It's part of your constitutional right in South Africa is to have a house. But there's not enough money to build everyone a house. So there's people on wait lists for years and years and years and years. And so people build literally tin shacks. I mean, shacks made out of tin and wood. And it's growing so quickly. Now, this photo was taken in 2016. I took this photo again in 2018. And there's about 3,000 more people living there. So about 500 more shacks that have appeared. So you can, sorry, just children screaming in the background just threw me off a bit. It is a horrifying image, I guess. But this image, I went home and I I only had 200 people that liked my Facebook page at the time. I was not a big shot photographer kind of a dude. I just had 200 people that liked my Facebook page, a couple friends, and that was it. And I went home and I posted this photo onto Facebook and I said, today I'm starting a little project. Today I'm starting a little project on inequality. This is Lake Michel, and I described Lake Michel, and this is Masapumalele, I described Masapumalele. I didn't call it Unequal Scenes, I didn't have the name yet. And I went to bed, and overnight, this photo completely went viral. So I woke up, and there was like hundreds of comments, and hundreds of shares, and thousands of views, and people going back and forth commenting on what this photo represented. And I know sometimes it's similar to think that America and South Africa have similar sort of racial issues, but I'd say the one big thing about South Africa is like people are not afraid to put stuff onto social media that comes from dark places in their hearts. And by that I mean, there was some pretty terrible stuff that was written on my Facebook page about me and about what this photo represented and about everything that comes with that. It's still up, by the way. You can go and look at it if you want. So it was scary. I'm not going to lie. It was kind of scary because I'm not even South African, right? So to put my foot in the middle of this huge debate on race and land and really politics was a tough place to be in. And I have to say the reason why I kept going forward is because I said that one word project. Today I'm starting a little project on inequality. Because then people were like, oh, well, we want to see more photos in the project. Keep posting. And I was like, oh my God, no, I got to take more photos. So it was the best thing that ever happened to me because I got the courage up, that supported me. Everyone saying this is a really important photo encouraged me, and I went and I took more photos. So the next place I went to is also about 20 miles away from Cape Town, the city center. Masapumalele, by the way, is about 20 kilometers actually south of the city center. This is about 30 kilometers east, a place called Strand. And Strand is a similar situation. This was actually the first township in the Western Cape, which is the province that Cape Town is in. So it's kind of like middle-class neighborhood, and then this block of formal and informal housing that just stands out like a sore thumb. The more research I've done on this particular township, the more interesting it becomes to me, actually. But the apartheid government would put in buffer zones. There's shacks that have been built in the middle of this buffer zone. I haven't found any official categorization of how wide the buffer zone should be. But everywhere around Cape Town, they seem to be about 250 meters wide. So the apartheid government would also separate people not only with roads and stuff, but with just those empty pieces of land, about 250 meters wide, that if you've ever been to the Berlin Wall, you know, remember how they had those killing strips on either side of the Berlin Wall? So if you managed to jump over, the guards would have a clear shot at you. That's always sort of what I thought of when I saw those. And then this is the photo that I took. And so these photos continued to go sort of viral to viral, if I can say that's not a phrase. They just continued to keep going viral, and I started to do more interviews, and I started to realize I needed to show the rest of South Africa. So just briefly, this is a town called Durban. It's the third city in South Africa after Johannesburg and Cape Town. Durban, I love the story behind this photo, even though it's not a very nice photo, but the story behind it, and this, by the way, is probably one of the most famous photos of the series. This golf course is actually named after a very famous golfer in South African history. He was an Indian golfer. So during apartheid, Indians were also prejudiced. And he was such a good golfer that he was competing at the same level as Gary Player in the 1960s. So my grandpa had Gary Player golf clubs. Maybe some of you guys remember the name. He's a South African golfer, a white guy. And in 1967, this golfer, his name is Papua Sugalum, Indian, went up against Gary Player, white, in Durban and won. And at the awards ceremony, because Durban is kind of a tropical climate, a thunderstorm moved in, and it started to pour down rain. And everyone ran into the clubhouse, but the clubhouse was whites only. So there's this really famous photo of Papua Sugalum getting his trophy outside in the pouring rain. And in a perfect world, that would be the photo that changed everything, but it actually just made life more repressive. And Papua Sugalum's passport was then taken away. He wasn't allowed to play in any more international events, and he died basically a drunk, penniless, from a heart attack a couple years later. So this golf course was then named after him after '94, and this informal settlement here took form and then essentially exists there now on the golf course land. A lot of these informal settlements are basically illegal squats. This is in Johannesburg. This is another one of the more famous photos from the series. This is a place called Kaya Sands. This doesn't have as interesting of a story. I mean, Kaya Sands is a very desperate informal settlement, and it's got a long history. But the dichotomy on either side of that road, I haven't found too many other better examples around the world, actually, than that photo right there. Yeah?
Quick question. What altitude are these, generally speaking, what altitude are these?
Well, the limit of a DJI drone is 500 meters above ground level. So somewhere between 100 and 500 meters. So yeah, this is Johannesburg. Once I started taking the rest of the photos around South Africa, this project, it's kind of become a thing internationally as well. And Thomson Reuters in London had picked up on the story, and they contacted me to go to the world's 5 biggest slums. And I know that that's a loaded word, so forgive me for using it. Slumscapes was the name of this project that Paula, who's the editor at Place, which is a Thomson Reuters Foundation initiative, created, and she wanted me to do the drone work at the 5 biggest slums. But then I didn't end up going to Pakistan because for some reason her bosses thought it'd be a bad idea to have an American with a drone go to Pakistan and take photos of people's houses. So I ended up going to Cape Town, Nairobi, Mumbai, and Mexico City. And the reason why I put this in is because this project very quickly then, this is 3 months after I took that first photo, became this big global project. So this is Mexico City and Kabira in Nairobi, Mumbai, and then Cape Town. And this project was pretty successful. You can still see it. If you Google slumscapes, no one else has come up with another competing slumscapes website. Imagine that. Just a quick digression. I think it's really interesting, the word slum compared to informal settlement, compared to township, compared to ghetto, compared to any other word that you use to describe these areas. It's just an interesting sort of side digression. I encourage you guys, if you're interested, to just sort of Google the history of the word and what in your lives you might refer to places like this as versus what people there refer to it as versus what it should be referred to as. These are all very floaty, sort of subjective arguments, but they mean quite a bit to some people. For example, no one in Mumbai will ever call that area anything else than a slum, or maybe I think it's Chwala is the Indian word for it. But if you go to South Africa, that word is highly offensive, and I'm pretty sure in America it would be offensive to refer to an informal area or an impoverished area as a slum as well. So it's just interesting. Mumbai is incredibly, well, it's overwhelming. If anyone's ever been there, you know what I'm talking about. I'm also a photojournalist by training, so a lot of the stories had typical traditional photojournalistic kind of images. These guys are part of a story. They make ornamental fence post knobs. If you ever wonder where your ornamental fence post knobs come from. Mexico City, and a lot of these places, people sometimes ask me about the research. How do you find these places? I think sometimes people think that I fly over Mexico City until I find something that looks like that. I mean, that would be an incredibly time-intensive process. So basically what I try to do in every place that I go is, if any journalists in here, if you're familiar with the term fixer, but you basically have someone in country, in city, that knows the city inside and out. Like if I came to Boston, I would try to find someone in Boston who knew the city really, really well, probably some sort of journalist or photographer or documentary filmmaker, who could then show me immediately where to go and what to do. Obviously this is an expensive project, so I try to limit the time that I have to spend in hotels, etc. In Mexico City, there's a helicopter pilot who did a very similar body of work that I reached out to with the help of my friend, because he didn't speak English, called Oscar Ruiz, and Oscar helped me find some of these places. Mexico also, I think it's the North America's largest city, by population. It's vast. It's really overwhelming. So there's situations like this, and the march of progress, if you can call it that, is pretty dramatic. It is progress. I mean, I shouldn't say it like that. Nairobi is a really interesting example. I'll talk a little bit more about Nairobi and what we're doing now there a little bit later, but Kabira is quite a different looking place than Cape Town, as you can see here. Just the typology of the building structures themselves look a lot different. And there's this really, I'm obsessed with sort of trains, and because I'm a little boy, clearly, I'm like 8 years old. No, but like this train goes right through the middle of Kabira. So we basically had to capture it on drone. And they're changing it now. So from what I understand, they're building an easement on either side of that train line of 30 meters. But when I was there 2 years ago, this was the road. So if you wanted to walk to your neighbor's house, you would walk on the train tracks. Like kids, adults, old people, any doesn't matter. Everyone would use it. And then twice a day, this passenger train would barrel down the tracks. It's not going very slow. Like it's moving at speed. And everyone would just have to plaster themselves against the walls of their shacks or in between the cracks between them and let this train go by, which is absolutely incredible. And then finally, the last place that I did the project was Seattle. I'm sorry, it was America. And so the images, oops, that froze. The images around the corner, and the reason I'm pretty much talking to you right now is because of the USA images. And so I always wanted to come back to the States because this project sometimes is seen as like another one of those Africa's screwed up projects, right? So we're also familiar with this idea that Africa is a basket case and there's starving children and they're poor. And I really wanted to turn that on its head because that wasn't the reason I started this project at all. In fact, if you come to Cape Town, I think you'll be shocked how first world it is, quote unquote, right? Like, so coming back to the States, like I said, was really important to me. Because how could I take this sort of aesthetic of looking straight down from a drone and then apply it to what I saw and what is known? I mean, the data bears this out, that America is the most unequal country in the OECD. It's the most unequal country in the developed world, if you want to call it that. It's increasingly unequal. So from the 1970s onwards, it's become more unequal every year. You might have thought the financial crisis would have taken care of that, but actually America has become even more unequal. And by unequal, I mean the top 1/10 of the top 1% of income earners, of wealth in this country has continued to get more of a share of wealth after 2008 than before, which is to say quite a bit. And I'm sure you've seen the WEF numbers that have come out every year around Davos, that the top 8 people in the world earn the same as the bottom 50%. I think last year it was the top 10, and now it's the top 8. I'm sure it's going to be the top 6 or 5 next year. I just kind of find that unacceptable, to be fair. And this isn't an attack on the middle class. It's certainly not an attack on the normal rich, but it is an attack on the people who orchestrate sort of these big financial plays and are that very, very small amount of people that conspire against everyone else. I mean, that's kind of how I see it. And it's not really a conspiracy when you look at the data either. For example, at the LSE, the International Institute for Inequality Studies, they're doing work on this. I just happen to be looking at it through photography, but a lot of other people, really, really smart people, are looking at this through the terms of economics. But America's different, right? I mean, that was Oakland. This is Seattle. I started off with the idea that through homelessness, I could tell this story of inequality. I found that quite difficult to do, even though in Seattle, for example, there's tent cities now. So they've set up tent cities for homeless people because the problem is so bad. For example, in the Bay Area, when I went there, does anyone recognize this building in the Bay Area? Did someone say? It's actually the Facebook building. So this is Facebook's HQ. And if it resolved a little bit better, which it's not going to, you'll see there's a homeless camp right across the road there with about 60 people that live there and all sorts of little pathways that go to it. These visual juxtapositions are sort of what I was trying to get at. I feel like it's a powerful image. I didn't really feel like I nailed it as well as I could have. But when I started to get to Detroit, where my whole family is from originally, it started to become a little bit more evident because it started to look a little bit more like Africa, to tell you the truth. This is a city that has gone through extreme upheaval in the last decade, 20, 50 years actually. And a lot of the blighted buildings have actually been taken off the map now. They've been erased. They've been torn down by the federal government. So it actually looks a lot different than a lot of other cities. But I also started thinking now more when I went there, what laid the seeds for africanDRONE, like how can I move past just that simple aesthetic of small houses versus big houses, slum versus mansions. And I started to get a little bit more interested in these architectures, like I said, like sort of these underpinning systems that we all live sort of unknowingly underneath the rules of, if that makes sense. And since we're in the States, and I'm assuming this is a fairly educated audience, I'm not going to beat you over the head with what redlining is, but a process through which the federal government disenfranchised certain areas of most cities in the States, predominantly immigrant and African American parts of those cities. So this map of Detroit shows you where the government would not make a loan to. So if you were black and you lived in this little red square here, which I'm about to show you just now, you could not get a loan to improve your house. You couldn't get a loan to build a new house, and you couldn't get a loan to start a small business. It was just pretty much made impossible to you because you lived in a red zone. And you know, my whole family is from Detroit. Maybe some of you have been to Detroit or from Detroit. I had never heard of this, but an example of this writ large into the architecture of Detroit was this wall, which the locals refer to as the wall, which was the border of that red zone that I just showed you on the map. And it was all black at the time, because it was a red zone, obviously. And on the left-hand side of this wall was just empty fields. Let me see if the next photo... Yeah, so the next photo shows it from the aerial view. So this is the wall right in the middle, and on the left-hand side was just fields, empty fields, and then these were houses where black people lived. And a developer wanted to create that neighborhood on the left-hand side. He said, I want to make a development. The federal government said no. Well, I should say the bank said no, because the federal government said no. It's too close to the black neighborhood. So the guy, obviously a white guy, said, okay, I'll build a wall. I'll build a wall so that black people and white people won't mix. And that literally is what that wall is. It's still there to this day. And the neighborhood is now all African American. They've turned it into kind of a memorial, and they've painted the wall. But I interviewed some people in that neighborhood, and it's difficult to parse sometimes as a journalist what people will tell you versus what they actually believe, if I can just say that. And I don't see that wall as being as much of a monument to overcoming racial prejudice as it is to a memory of that racial prejudice. But maybe that's my own prejudice that I'm looking at that lens through. I don't know. But to this day, it's still there. And the idea that no one knows about it, like my grandma, my dad, who've lived there their entire lives, didn't know about it, I think also is a little bit weird. Detroit, and this is very similar with a lot of other American cities, use those redlined areas as reasons for where they would decide to build massive infrastructure projects around cities as well. And so that was the link I was trying to tell with this article that I wrote, and with this particular set of mosaicked photo, they're actually aerial images from an airplane that I found. At the Wayne State University has an archive of these, but no one had ever mosaicked them together. So I did that in Photoshop. Excuse me. And you can see from the left, which I think was taken in '62, to the right, which was taken in '73, you can see where the federal government decided to build interstates. Most of those areas where they built the interstates, not all of them, but a lot of them were these formerly redlined black areas, which had fallen into disrepair, which a lot of people called ghettos at the time. I'll point your attention out this one right here, which is I-375 and I-75, that comes out of the center of Detroit. It basically hollowed out an area called Black Bottom, which was a very thriving black area, which was considered the economic center of black Detroit at the time in the 60s. And today, Ford Field is there and a bunch of empty lots. So this isn't very different to, for example, Baltimore. And if you've seen the video around the corner, this is the same video that's playing. Baltimore just didn't have the federal funds to wipe out these blighted buildings. But this road right here is a perfect example of a neighborhood, West Baltimore, where they felt it was appropriate to build a road through. Unfortunately, that road doesn't go anywhere. So it's called the Road to Nowhere. It connects to the center of town, but it was supposed to connect 60, I can't remember the name of the road, to I-70, which never was completed. So it's basically this big eyesore, this example of the planning at the time, which was suited for the people in the periphery and the suburbs to get into the center of the city and leave as quickly as possible. It was basically for commuters. But for the residents of these American cities who live there, I don't know the Boston history well enough to tell you whether or not that happened in Boston, but I would gather that it probably did. You're shaking your head. It's really not rocket science, is it? I mean, like, this stuff, I'm sure everyone, once they start hearing this, going, yeah. Wherever I'm from, I'm sure something similar happened. I just only happened to be in Baltimore, Detroit, and Richmond, Virginia. Richmond, Virginia, this place called Jackson Ward, also a very, very historic black area in the 60s. It was called was it the Wall Street of the South or the Harlem of the South? Now I'm forgetting. It was either the Harlem or the Wall Street of the South. They used to call it one of those two. And this was it. They built I-95 right through the middle of it. And not in this photo, but just north of it, there's a church that everyone rallied around that I-95 actually bent around. So it was one small victory for activists, but the overwhelming story is of neglect and sort of destruction, as you can see now. Bringing this back to drones and technology, this is very difficult to see this kind of stuff from the ground. It's not a very difficult concept as to why drones make such a difference here. You could also, if you use data, you can see similar things. You could use data, you could use utility bills, you could use rent prices, you could use census demographics. I'm happening to use drones, but I truly believe drones are this democratic revolution, that I can go out and I can take this photo and I can impart some sort of knowledge and I can write an article that then goes into The Guardian. I wrote very little prior to starting Unequal Scenes, but I've since become, I guess, sort of a journalist. This idea that someone can sort of have an idea and then go out and inspire other people with that idea and a little bit of money and a little bit of tech, but very little. I mean, these drones are costing $1,000, $2,000 at this point, is really a revolution. Before 3-4 years ago, you had to rely on a pilot to take you up into the air to see this. A very, very expensive proposition. Or you had to rely on the government to tell you what it looked like from above, because the governments were the only people who had access to the airplanes or satellites. And in countries that I work in Africa, not necessarily South Africa, that's still the case because it's such a heavy-handed regulatory environment that you can't really fly drones. So I see this as a really empowering, really liberating technology. Happy to sort of have that conversation a little bit later with Ariana, because I know that there's a whole lot of nuance behind that, and then there's also obviously ethical issues with flying drones, but writ large, I feel like they're an incredibly empowering technology, just like the internet or cell phones. So on the back of this, I set up africanDRONE. We essentially use drones for good. It was set up on the back of a grant that I got from Code for Africa, which is a NGO based in 3 cities in Africa: Cape Town, Nairobi, and Dar es Salaam. Basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to use drones to mimic the success of Unequal Scenes, not necessarily with the aesthetic. Obviously you can see Unequal Scenes featured heavily in this video 2 years ago. But generally with the idea that Africans could be liberated in telling whatever story they wanted to tell by using this technology. We also do drone camps. And that's our website. I'm about 3/4 of the way through the presentation, just so you guys are all aware of where we're at as far as time. And I will not take it as an affront if you want to go get a beer in the back as you listen to the last 25%. I hate it when I'm thirsty and the guy won't shut up. So if you want to go, it's totally cool. I just want to show you a couple other things that aren't necessarily Unequal Scenes, but interesting ways that I'm using drones to sort of look at some issues around Africa and around other parts of the world. I showed you this video before. This is Kabira. Kabira is a slum, if you want to call it that, of about 1 million people in Nairobi, just on the outskirts of Nairobi. And Nairobi is growing really, really quickly. So it's quickly becoming a mega city, Millions of people are moving there. It's really haphazardly growing in the sense that there's slums right next to middle-class apartment buildings, right next to a really vibrant tech scene, right next to an agricultural area. And there's also a big national park, like a park where there's lions and giraffes and stuff, like literally right on the outside of town. It's a really interesting place. This road, why I wanted to focus on this road is because when I was there in 2016, they were about to build a road that was going to go right through the middle of Kabira. And I couldn't believe it, because Kabira is probably well, maybe it's not the most famous slum in the world, but it's one of the most famous slums. They've filmed a few movies there. When you go to Nairobi, they'll offer you tours to go into there. It's quite a safe place. It's quite a fun place. If I can say fun, it's like, no, that's a wrong word. It's a vibrant place, and it feels kind of lively, if I can say that. And when I went back in 2018, they had done it. So I went back 2 weeks after they had bulldozed this road in the middle of the night and displaced, well, there's us flying our drones to look at it. That's my partner, Chris. They had bulldozed about 11,000 people out of the middle of Kabira and moved, I can't remember the exact number, but it was 11 or 12 schools, including this one here. You can see it used to be a square, and now it's kind of cut in the middle like that. Hospitals, all sorts of stuff. Kabira is not known to have a very strong voting bloc one way or the other, so it's not like Dharavi in Mumbai with a really strong political stance, which is basically why Dharavi still exists to this day, which is where they filmed Slumdog Millionaire, which is where everyone in Mumbai wants to redevelop because it's right in the middle of the town. They want to put skyscrapers there. They want to make money off that land, but Dharavi has held out. Kabira hasn't. So they ended up building this road right through the middle of it, and I thought, okay, first of all, this is an amazing photo and horrifying. Let's get this photo done. But then I started thinking, what else can we do as africanDRONE to kind of give some value back to community organizations in Kabira? And I don't know if people are familiar with mapping, using drones for mapping. I'm assuming most of you are, because it's actually probably the most useful way of using drones, actually. Taking photos and videos is nice, but you can use drones to accurately map an area relatively quickly. And by accurately, I mean the same GPS coordinates as you would get with a satellite or an airplane, but with a whole lot better resolution, like an order of magnitude better. So if you go to Google Earth and you buy digital globe, or you find digital globe imagery, that's usually 31 centimeters per pixel. 31 centimeters is like, I don't know, that. And every pixel on your computer screen would be that resolution. So you couldn't really make out the features of a human being, for example. It would just be sort of a color blip. But a drone, depending on how high you fly in the air, you can get down to 1, 2, 3 centimeter per pixel. I think this one was 3.5. And that means you can start to make out people's features. You can definitely start to make out the edges of people's shacks and their cars and the golf course and whether or not there's people on the golf course. And this program, Pix4D, takes those images, stitches them together for you, and then puts them right on the map. And you can take this image then, this TIFF, and you could then put it into Google Earth, or you could give it to your GIS partners, and they could put it into their own maps. Which is what we did. Whoops. Sorry. Which is what we did with Map Kabira, which is a partner of OpenStreetMap. So Map Kabira didn't have accurate imagery of Kabira. We gave them this footage, and actually I took a whole lot more drone map of Kabira, and then they've imported that into their Map Kabira project, which you can see now. Which kind of sounds like, okay, that's a nice exercise, but so what? But I'll tell you why so what just now. Because we've also done this in, this is my partner Freddie. So Freddie and Chris are both my partners in africanDRONE. This is Dar es Salaam, which is the capital, well, it's actually not the capital of Tanzania, but it's the commercial center of Tanzania. Does anyone know what the capital of Tanzania is? This is like pub quiz. It's a town called Dodoma. It's like everyone thinks Toronto's the capital of Canada, but it's Ottawa. Anyways, I'm digressing again. This is, so Freddie was contracted to do this project called Romani Huria with africanDRONE to create a 3D model of this floodplain. And this river is called the Msimbazi River, because what the World Bank wanted to do was to map out where informal areas, where the shacks are in that floodplain. Maybe I'll play it for you again. In this floodplain, because they're oftentimes flooded out, and then the government has to either pay them restitution or they have to deal with the fallout if these people then get hurt or drown or something like that. And they had no way of actually seeing like where Dar es Salaam would flood when it does every year have the rainy season. Freddie flew drones over this area. He actually flew them over the whole city of Dar es Salaam. You can create fun videos like that, but it also gives you an elevation data, which is this, which you can overlay onto a map, which shows exactly where the low points are along the rivers, and these orange squares are the structures that they identified within that data that are at risk. So this is well known by probably any surveyors in the room of how you can do this with photogrammetry. The difference with drones is that one man can do this, or one woman could do this, or a small team of people could do this, and you could process this imagery and create these maps in, let's say, a week, versus weeks and weeks of flying and probably months and months of processing. So it extremely speeds up the speed at which you can do this and the cost point at which you can accomplish this stuff. I think the Romani Huria project was done with $200,000, which sounds like a lot of money, but when you consider it costs millions and millions of dollars to fly airplanes over cities, to take aerial photos and to stitch this together, and the people's time to stitch this together, it's about, again, an order of magnitude cheaper and faster. Another couple of projects, we've supported Khadija and the Zanzibar Mapping Initiative to map the entire island of Zanzibar, which is actually the biggest map using drones created anywhere in the whole world. Zanzibar is off the coast of Tanzania. And we've also supported, through our partners at Code for Africa, africanDRONE and Code for Africa are our partners, sea sensors that will go into the ocean to record dynamite blasts. And the reason I put this in is because it's not just about drones. I mean, I'm really passionate about how technology in general can help people see the world in a new way. It doesn't cost a lot of money. These sensors cost about $5,000 total. I was actually filming this, which was super exciting and fun, because I used to be a dive master in Thailand, and I got to dive again for the first time in like 12 years to put this down. This isn't very deep anyways. But what they're doing, they fish with dynamite in Tanzania. We have drone camps, like I said, which is really important. We don't actually train people to use drones. I actually don't really believe that everyone should fly drones, even though I know it's a really empowering technology. I don't really feel like everyone needs to be flying a drone to make use of that technology. But for the select people that do feel comfortable and have a good idea of the risks at stake and the money involved, we do offer drone camps, and oftentimes journalists come to those drone camps and we support them with grants. So we've done, I don't even know how many at this point, but quite a few stories in collaboration with, for example, this one's in Kampala, journalists using drones or hiring one of our drone pilots to go tell stories better about, for example, losing swamp area around Kampala. We have started to do a little bit of sort of investigative work and breaking news, if I say that, but it's quite challenging in Cape Town just because of the, well, it's dangerous. It's physically dangerous to try to uncover, for example, illegal horse racing, or we've looked at illegal poaching of abalone around Cape Town, both of which are kind of popular and run by gangs in the city. This is quite interesting. So gangs will steal horses from horse owners, bring them to the strip, and then they'll race them bareback until the horses are basically exhausted. And they'll keep the winners. It's like dogfighting or something. They'll keep the winners. They might let the losers go free, or they might keep them as their own horses. They don't kill them. They don't like shoot them there. But basically, it's not good for the horses. They're really exhausted. People are losing their horses, they're stolen. And we were the first people, this guy Garth actually figured out where it happened. He's just a concerned citizen, and then we went out and shot that prior footage to uncover it. And this was kind of like on one of the big investigative news shows in South Africa. We've also done with poaching and a few other sort of investigative projects. So this is not something we directly support, but this is something that I felt like was important to include. Has anyone ever heard of Zipline? No one's ever heard of Zipline? No way. Okay, one person in the back. Okay, cool. 2 people. 3 people. Everyone's hands going up. Danielle. No? Zipline is the world's first commercial delivery service by drone. It's in Rwanda. And the Rwandan government is very drone forward, very drone positive. In fact, all of East Africa is, surprisingly. Zipline, though, is a Silicon Valley startup. And their idea is to put blood inside these drones and then deliver it to hospitals. So I went and visited here. This was actually a shoot that I was on for Time Magazine, so it has nothing to do with africanDRONE. It was just completely separate. But I was blown away by this. Like, basically, in this hangar here, which is just outside of Kigali, the hospitals in the surrounding area, and Rwanda is a tiny country, will send either an SMS or a WhatsApp or some form of communication to that hangar. They'll say, we need X amount of blood. It needs to be this blood type, blah, blah, blah. The people there will then load up these drones, which are fixed-wing drones, so they're like little airplanes. They'll put it on this catapult. It takes off. They follow everything on their iPad. So they allowed me to look at the iPad, and you follow the track of the drone as it's going over the hills in Rwanda. It's incredible. And then we went to the hospital. We drove there to the other side of the hospital, where the drone will fly overhead, little doors will open up, and then the blood will drop out with a little parachute. Yeah. So the blood drops out with a parachute, the doctors catch it, and then they run inside and save the person. It's incredible, really, and it is a little vision of the future. This is the Type 1 drones. They just started using their Type 2 drones, which are higher capacity. It's incredible, and the foresight of the Rwandan government is really at the heart of this, because the tech is there. So this tech is, well, it's a Silicon Valley company, so they test this in California. So these could be flying in Boston tomorrow if the government wanted them to be. But this is the result of a lot of coordination. It's a result of a lot of foresight on the part of the government, and to some extent, this is an R&D exercise for what will probably be happening in Europe and America in the next 5-10 years, I would imagine. I doubt that we're going to be delivering pizzas and beer with drones like everyone thought 5 years ago, but sort of high-value, small weight parcels like that, I could see that might take off, no pun intended, in the next few years. What was I going to say about that? Yeah, I'm happy to answer more questions about this because I think it's quite fascinating and actually quite exciting and a lot more practical to some extent in people's minds of why drones are a good thing versus sort of these more undercover investigative things. The next video that I'm going to show you is an organization that is set up by the World Bank. It's actually a challenge to use drones to deliver material around Lake Victoria, called the Lake Victoria Challenge. If any of you guys are interested at all in what's happening here or in africanDRONE in general, I highly recommend you get in touch with me, and I could put you in touch with the Lake Victoria Challenge. This is like 1.5 minutes long, and I'll try to put the microphone here so you can hear it. But
East Africa is becoming the hub for cargo drone innovation and testing, from Rwanda's blood delivery project to Malawi's drone corridor. Now the city of Mwanza in Tanzania is launching the Lake Victoria Challenge, an annual showcase for the advances in drone cargo delivery. The shores of Lake Victoria are home to over 30 million people, and while the lake brings huge benefits, it also brings logistical problems. The Lake Victoria Challenge is bringing together experts in health supply chains and transportation with cutting-edge global technology in autonomous aerial cargo delivery, providing solutions that can make a difference in the hard-to-reach communities of the Great Lakes region. Join us at the Lake Victoria Challenge.
It's the world's largest accumulation of people without a major city. There's 35 million people that live around the lake. A lot of them live on islands. There's very little infrastructure. So Zipline, as you saw, was set up to leapfrog that infrastructure. Otherwise, people will have to drive motorcycles, and it's windy roads, and it might be raining, and there might be accidents, or it might take a long time. Drones can obviously leap right over that. That's what the World Bank is trying to kickstart in the Lake Victoria region, which borders Rwanda. So Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania are the four countries that border it. And this is being held in Mwanza, which is about 100 Ks from the border with Rwanda, so on the southern side of the lake. We're handling the communications, and we're actually handling some of the scholarship opportunities for young African drone engineers and other teams to come and participate. There was a year zero event last year that we handled as well, but year one, which is the main competition, and people are competing for like a real contract. So the Tanzanian government is offering a contract for the winner of this competition. It's in November 25th. If any of you guys are in Tanzania and want to come as well, let me know. And there's a lot of, it's mostly German companies and Swiss companies, but there are some American companies. And there's a variety of challenges that they have to do to win. And if they win, then they get this contract, which is pretty interesting. So this stuff is happening. It's not the future. It's literally happening. It's happening in East Africa, which who would have thought, right? Okay, almost done. Future Unequal Scenes, I've partnered up with DJI, which is this drone manufacturer, and Hasselblad, which is a camera manufacturer maybe some of you have heard of. Did you know that DJI owns Hasselblad now? That's something that always shocks people. So DJI, the Chinese company, now owns Hasselblad, the Swedish camera manufacturer. And they've created this amazing new camera, which takes 100 megapixel medium format images, which I've started to put together with portraits of people who live on either side of the divide. It's been really successful. I just had a show open in Brussels 2 weeks ago, which is amazing. And the images, you can print them like as large as that white screen there, and they won't lose their detail. They look really, really amazing. It's quite impactful. It's the way that I wanted people to see my images in the first place. I also have a project on hostels, which are these workers' sort of labor buildings in South Africa. They're not fun backpackers hangouts. It's where black people had to work during the time of the gold mines and the gold rush around Johannesburg. I've worked on some environmental projects, and I want to do a lot more because I'm quite passionate about climate change. I think drones are probably best suited for environmental issues, not necessarily human issues. This is Smith Island, which is an island off the coast of Maryland. And this is one of those elevation maps that I told you about that you can create with a drone very quickly. So on one battery, about 25 minutes of fly time, you can create an elevation map of Rhodes Point, Maryland, which is about a meter above sea level in Maryland, and I created that GIF on that side. I haven't actually published this yet, but I just wanted to show you what you can do when you create a GIF based on the inundation layer that you can create off that elevation map to show people where it will flood first, what will happen during a hurricane, etc. And then lastly, I just wanted to show off this footage, and it doesn't look very good here, but it looks awesome on the iPad, of other forms of sort of wildlife and nature and environmental issues that I'm looking at. This is off the coast of South Africa. There's a phenomenon where these sardines come every year, and then dolphins and sharks and birds all dive on these sardines, and they create these defensive balls. They're called bait balls. And I captured one on a drone, which is quite rare. I don't know if you can see it. There's like a ball of fish here that these dolphins are going crazy for and just pursuing and eventually annihilating. So, AfricanDRONE and Unequal Scenes. If you're interested, you can go to my website and send me a link, or if you're ever in Cape Town, let me know and I can meet up with you and hang out. We can go surf. No sharks necessarily involved. And this is my contact information if you want to get in touch with me, or share this event. I'm sure the BSA would also love for you to share this event and tag the BSA as well. But thank you so much for your patience. That was a really long talk, and I hope you found it interesting. And I'm really, really excited about the conversation we're about to have as well. I'm interested to hear your thoughts about what I just said. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Johnny. That was a very thought-provoking presentation. So the first thing I'll do is I'll ask one question, which I'm sure all of our audience wants to hear, and then I'll open it up for all of you to ask questions. Which one is your favorite image and why?
That's what everyone wants to hear. I think people are thinking, is this legal? I know people are thinking that. No? Okay, we'll just sidestep that. Well, my favorite photo, So the funny thing is, and I'll just segue into something that maybe some of the photographers in the room will find interesting. I'm a portrait photographer at heart. Like, I love taking photos of people's faces. And I found it quite challenging, and maybe not challenging is the wrong word, but I found it quite surprising at least, that the minute I removed people's faces from the photos, people started paying attention to them. It's almost like an emotional weight is lifted when you're looking at images of poverty when they don't have anyone visible in them. And that was a point that was brought up to me by a journalist very early on. She said, do you think people are sick of looking at images of poverty in Africa? And I think she's got a point. You know, a lot of people have used Unequal Scenes images around the world. MIT is one of them, actually, which is why you're here. A lot of institutions, a lot of NGOs, a lot of governments. I feel like people find the concept of what I'm trying to get across easier to digest and more palatable to talk about when it's a pattern or an architecture issue. I think it's just how we're working, I mean, emotionally as people. So I think that's quite interesting. So to answer your question, some of those portraits that I've done recently with the Hasselblad camera are probably my favorite. They're not the aerial images, just because I love that. But I also see the value and the power in these aerial images. But yeah, what's your favorite image?
The ones you showed?
Yeah.
My favorite image of the ones you showed is actually the first one. The one where you show the very rich development on the right and all the informal settlements on the left. I think that's a very stark image, and for me that I study cities, it was very impressive to see that, right? And even if you're walking, and you can't really appreciate when you're when you're walking that sort of stark differences, and I think that's pretty amazing. Yep. So from the audience, who wants to ask a question?
So my engineering firm does a lot of work with drones for our survey side, but my question relates to engineering. So we do a lot of stormwater work and looking at stormwater master planning. And when I look at your images and I see the buildings, it reminds me of a project we did for the city of Philadelphia called the Philadelphia Green Plan, which looked at trees. And if you look at South Philadelphia versus West Philadelphia, and you look at one tree in front of a house, and you have a house here and a house here in South Philadelphia. This has a tree, this doesn't. This house is worth more. The city gets more tax revenue because of it. If you multiply that times 100, there's better air quality.
I love that you bring that up, because it's another example of one of these almost like hidden architectures that relates so much to our lived experience, right? How many trees are in our neighborhood? Or I don't know, how many, and this might sound ridiculous to an American audience, but how many toilets are nearby? In Khayelitsha, which is one of the slummy areas of Cape Town that I showed you, the city actually puts in chemical toilets because there's no plumbing. And depending on the availability of those chemical toilets to your house and how far you have to walk, the crime rate might spike, the women's health issues might spike. There's a lot of these hidden quality of life and lived experience issues that actually relate to some extent, these hidden architectures or these like clues that you have to pick around the surface on. And I think in this new sort of Internet of Things sensor world that we live in now, we're going to start to uncover more and more of these ideas. MIT has their Treepedia at the lab that you work with, which actually looks at tree cover in major cities, including Cape Town. But I've also noticed that the tree cover isn't very well represented in Cape Town because you also use, I think, Google Street View. And Google Street View cars won't go into the slums in Cape Town because it's too dangerous. So there's just big areas that are black in Cape Town where they should be red, and red meaning no trees. But yeah, thank you for that. I haven't particularly looked at trees. One of my new projects that I'm starting right now is looking at the pathways that people carve into the earth as they walk between informal areas. But it's kind of an art project in a way. I don't really know. But that's how Unequal Scenes started too, so I don't know where it's going to go. But from the air, you get these really interesting organic veins of a city where people have worn pathways into the dirt in places like Khayelitsha. And I think with sort of the right approach, that might be quite powerful to people. Again, it's not really an American issue, but for where I live, it's pretty pertinent. Yeah.
Since you brought the legal issue, I'd like to hear you talk about that a little bit, because I think that, do I need this? I'd just like to talk a little bit about the legal issues, legal ramifications around, also they can be politically charged images that you are showing and distributing, and just what the effect is, both in terms of pushback or in terms of use of them for a more activist intention.
So, I'll start by saying that every country has different precedent, legal precedent, and every country has different freedom of information, legal structures, and every country has different air law. And those three components really sort of factor into how I fly and where I fly and what I represent. That's in broad strokes. America has one of the most sort of permissive flying environments of any country in the world. For example, I can fly above your house, and you generally have no recourse to tell me not to. It's legal for me to fly above your house if the point at which the drone is over, you're protected with a roof. And if the drone were to fall, it would hit the roof before it hits you. If I fly over your backyard and you're standing right underneath the drone, then I would be in the wrong because you're uncovered. But as far as your right to privacy, you don't have a right to privacy in America. And all of the airspace above your head is governed by the FAA. It's not governed by you, like you don't own the air rights, essentially. South Africa is much different, and actually Europe is quite different as well. Generally speaking, Europe is quite different. I don't know every form of air law around the world, but in South Africa, for example, you can't fly over someone's property, and you can't fly over public roads, and you can't do this, that, and the other, because of the idea that people's rights extend above where they live. Not so much their right to privacy, but just in general, their right to control what happens above them. So, there is a bit of a gray area when I'm flying above communities of people that I find needs to be, those boundaries need to be pushed in order to get across the message as an activist, as an art activist, of what I'm trying to do. And I have, believe me, wrestled with the ramifications of what I do in a legal and an ethical sense from day one. And I don't have all the answers. I will say that right now. I am not a morally perfect person, nor do I have the right answer of what you should do. And when people ask me, like, oh, I've got a drone, like, what should I be doing? Should I be doing the exact same thing as you? I always say, I'm not in a position to give you that advice. I can only show you what I'm doing and hopefully provoke a conversation with these photos. But it is a very contentious sort of new use of technology that doesn't even have so much to do with safety, I feel. It has to do with the ethics of how we use technology to uncover the world around us. And I just fall more on the side of there being less regulations and more use of technology to uncover things, just like the conversations we used to have when cell phone cameras came out about whether or not this was something that we wanted to go into bathrooms and changing rooms and everyone was going to have a camera in their pocket. Well, that conversation didn't really go anywhere, right? Because now everyone's got a cell phone and it's given us great good in the world in general. I think the conversation might be a little bit more nuanced if you talk about social media, for example, or you talk about drones in the context of weaponizing drones and how ISIS is using drones. That then I think gets into a more black and white area where, of course, that's something that I disagree with, using drones that way, and I feel like there should be regulations around airports and other sensitive installations. The idea that I shouldn't be allowed to fly a drone even a few meters off the ground in a public street in South Africa if there's no traffic coming in either way, I find too far towards shutting down my access to information for the sake of either safety, which is the stated aim, or what I think is the real sort of underlying reason, which is access to control, or access of control. Sorry, control of access of information. So that, I'm really choosing my words carefully here because I know I'm being filmed as well. So I just want to say that it's a challenging thing to do, which is also why I don't fly very often anymore. You know, I often get asked now, because I'm kind of known as this drone activist, to go do a lot of things that are very risky, and there's really no payoff for me. There's payoff to maybe see something that would otherwise be impossible to uncover only because I can do it, but I can think of very few of those sort of situations. Most people can do what I do, so rather them assume the risk if I don't have to. That's how I see things nowadays. In my future drone projects, I also will be more careful in how I fly. 3 years ago, there weren't very strong drone regulations around the world. Mexico had no drone regulations 3 years ago, for example. Now they do. So things are also iterating and changing all the time. Just my last point on that, South Africa has the most restrictive drone regulations of anywhere on Earth. Isn't that weird? It costs about $30,000 to be a company that uses drones legally in South Africa. In America, it costs $150. So think of that difference as well. So that's when I'm talking about like shutting down people's access to information. Those are the sorts of regulations that are being put in place because of safety that really get under my skin. africanDRONE is not a political organization, but I talk about it every chance that I can because I think it's outrageous.
So beyond regulation, I'm curious about the slide that you ended with, like to empower us all. I mean, in a way, it empowers the drone users, all of them, but I'm curious how you see your relationship with the communities that you take footage from and how sort of you dialogue either before or how they perceive the drone and also like what they get back from it and like how that varies between context in your experience.
It's a good question. Drones are interesting because satellites buzz overhead all the time. Boston is mapped every year, I'm assuming, if not more frequently, with airplanes that take photos of Boston, just like any other major city that the city government uses to create their own maps. Passenger airplanes fly overhead all the time. So there's a lot of data that's being collected already. You work in data in a lab that uses data to understand the world better. Mobile phone data, anonymized or not, private companies are collecting data all the time on our apps. I could go on and on and on. I don't find drones to be fundamentally different. I don't find drones to be in a different sport. They might not be in the same ballpark, but they're definitely in the same sport. And the problem generally becomes people associating the object with an object of surveillance because of its anonymity, rather than the use of the data for whatever purpose that person uses it for. And maybe it's because it's so personal to see that object hovering above your house or to hear it and not know where the operator is. I totally get that. I was hiking one time. I'm sure all of you guys have similar stories. And I saw a drone and I didn't know who was flying it. And because I fly drones, I didn't hate it, but I also wished it wasn't there. So, and this might be a kind of a crappy answer, like I do have ethics for how I fly. I'll never fly below a certain height. Just because I know above that height, people can't really hear the drone and they definitely can't see it. So I know I'm not bothering people in the sense that they're being bothered by the presence of the physical object. I also don't hover in places for very long, so I have a very good plan of how I fly so that I can capture photos quickly and then move on. And I also don't necessarily, no, I can say this categorically, like I don't use the images in a way that would ever be construed as unethical. We might have issues and we could have a conversation if you want about the ethics of how I capture the photos, but how I'm using them, I'm hoping that I've gotten across my point quite well, that I'm using them for morally pure reasons. I am also a businessman. This is also my business. BSA doesn't pay me to come here, and I don't get paid to do anything else except this artwork. I sell my prints. I also monetize those portraits of people that I took earlier. I do this just like any other photographer does, any other documentary photographer, by getting those people to accede, to be on camera, getting them to sign a model release, and then getting them to be, well, at the end of the day, that is what constitutes affirmation as far as whether or not it's okay. If they were to call me up afterwards, even though we have a release, and say, I really don't want you to show that photo anymore, of course I would stop showing that photo. Is it unethical if I show their neighborhood without asking everyone in the neighborhood, though? And that's where I think I'm open to have a conversation about, is it if I'm taking the photo at 10 meters, or if I'm taking the photo at 100 meters, does that change things? I think it does. And for me, that level, that boundary is about 40 meters high, is about 120 feet. So I try to stay above 40 meters. At that point, people can't really hear or see the drone. Details start to be harder to make out. You can't really see individual faces or features. You can't really see what people are doing necessarily. It also depends on the resolution of the camera. So this is a very murky conversation to get into. It's not very well litigated in courts. There's not very much precedent. So at the end of the day, I'm flying blind a little bit. Again, no pun intended, but I'm doing the best I can. I think the more interesting, nuanced argument, if we're talking about me as a privileged photographer, taking photos of poor black people in Africa as a privileged white American photographer, that is the argument that I think is potentially more pertinent to have in the African context. And there's a long history of white photojournalists taking photos of people of color in places like slums like Kabira and then using them for profit without necessarily sort of even getting the agreement of the subjects in the first place. And I struggle with that. I'm not gonna lie, I struggle with that. I don't know if I do things any differently from what I've done, but I definitely understand the argument, am open to having conversations about that topic and realize that I'm not a perfect person, so I might be wrong.
No, but I think it's a good point because we face as researchers too this constant struggle between what is regulated and the state of that and how we morally think we should do research. And for example, for me, it's more on, I use sensors to understand how people use public spaces, for example. And so there's been a huge push for people to understand them using cameras. And so for me, I feel that is kind of a little bit too invasive on the public realm. And so I try to use technologies that are related to your phone or that don't actually capture any images at all. So I think it comes also from our position as practitioners and as researchers to sort of set the pace at what we want to collect and how we use it. So, yeah. More questions from the audience?
Hi there. Thank you. It's for recording purpose, right? So I admire you so much about your courage to confront conflicts. Basically, in my understanding, you are the rubber kappa with a drone for contemporary purposes. For references, Robert Kappa is a war journalist for World War II in Vietnam and died in Vietnam. And then my question for you is that have you been confronted inside a conflict as an individual? Because you're a photojournalist, we always confronted by people. And then how did you decelerate it?
Thank you so much for that reference. I am not worthy of that reference, but thank you anyways. And I find it funny that you reference Robert Capa because Robert Capa famously said, if it's not a good enough photo, you're not close enough, which is really funny in the context of what I just talked about with the drone. But I'm a big wimp. I mean, I love that you think that about me because like the little kid inside me is like, yes, that sounds cool. I'm reading a biography that I bought yesterday actually on Marie Colvin. So she's a photojournalist. She had an eye patch. Maybe you recognize her. She is such a badass. She went into like Syria, Sri Lanka, like Bangladesh, like really difficult situations, was shot. That's how she lost her eye. I mean, she's courageous. She's a war photographer. I've never been in a conflict zone. I've never shot a conflict. I do work in informal areas which sometimes are dangerous from a personal safety point of view, and because of what I talked about earlier, I usually don't have a big crew with me. In fact, usually it's just me, maybe with one other person like a fixer, or the first photos actually was my girlfriend. The first, say like 4 cities that I did in South Africa was just me and Natalie, my ex-girlfriend I should say. And that, yeah, I guess you just plan it out really well. So you know exactly where the exit points are. You know exactly where trouble might come from. You go there on the day and kind of scout it out. You take the drone out, you fly very quickly because drones are loud, especially the Inspire. That first drone I showed you is a big drone and it's loud. And immediately people would surround you and just kind of, I know this sounds a bit gross, but like trying to get out of there as quickly as possible was my number one concern. Like getting the shot, but then also leaving as quickly as possible. I know that's kind of like borderline, like if you were Robert Capa or a documentary photographer, the number one thing that you would focus on is getting people's buy-in. And that's how I work if I'm on the ground. That photo of the Indian guys in that knob factory, of course, that's how you have to work. You have to go there, you have to earn people's trust, you have to spend time with people, get to know them, they have to allow you in. Otherwise, it's just acquisitional. It's like, well, I don't know you at all, but I could take a pretty good photo of you right now, I'm sure. But what would that photo really mean? Do you know what I mean? Like, we didn't make any sort of connection, and even if it might be a good photo technically, it's not sort of at the essence of what good photojournalism should be aspiring to be. For example, drone stuff is completely different, in my opinion. And the physical safety things were pretty paramount in the beginning. And in Mexico, it was actually quite challenging as well. But I'm a little older and wiser now. I work with bigger crews and I work with bigger drones, and things are a lot more sort of, they're less hectic. So it's less cowboy and more sort of, what did cowboys turn into? Middle class soccer moms? I don't know. I'm just a normal person now who does a job. But thank you. You're recording this, right? Because, okay, I'm just going to play that back later tonight.
I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about the potential of drones to be combined with different technologies. So combining drone footage with social media, with satellite images, to monitor things that we care about cities. So more specifically, like urban change, or in the United States, processes of like gentrification, things that are dynamic.
Well, I'm struggling with that. You're probably better suited to answer that than I am. However, I can say that sensors is the number one thing that I would think of off the cuff. So in Nairobi, we have a project, well, Code for Africa has a project where we're working with air sensors for particulate matter, so just PM 2.5 and 10, not gases, that we're affixing to buildings. However, affixing them to drones is something that we're exploring. I just don't necessarily, I don't know if I see the benefit in putting them onto drones versus putting them onto buildings. Because really, when you're talking about collecting data and sensors, you want that over time, right? And drones go up for 20 minutes and then they have to come back down. So it's a different technology. It's a bit of a different approach. Mapping, 3D modeling, photo and video, potentially various kinds of sensors for spot sensing of things. For example, you can mount a thermal camera onto drones very easily and cheaply. I say cheaply, but it's more expensive than a normal camera, but it's fairly cheap. It'll bolt onto that drone there, and you could then go take thermal images of a building, a smokestack, a dump, for example, where are the hot spots in a dump. You could put an NDVI camera on that drone, and you could go over a field, and you could see exactly where the green spots are and where the brown spots are in the field. So farmers are doing this to tell where they need to water, so precision agriculture. But as far as flying drones, I'm not seeing 100% of where they're going to be used in the sense of sensing cities in the future. Where I do think drones are going to be used is in, for example, structural inspection, not necessarily even elevated structural inspection, but like pipes and tunnels. Imagine all the pipes and tunnels in the city below our feet that could be inspected with like a roving drone, like something with wheels, or maybe they have drones now with cages built around them. If they bump into walls, they'll just bounce right off. Those have been around for 2 or 3 years. They have got drones with multiple cameras to create 360 images. For example, if you wanted to sense a small section of pipe, you could sense it very quickly at one time instead of taking photos directionally and then stitching them together later. I see that as being more and more useful in the sense of automating processes that humans already do. As far as stuff that we haven't been able to do before that drones will then magically give the ability to, I don't really think that's going to be much of a thing. Delivery as well. We talked a little bit about delivery, and I think, but in general, I think all of us 5 years ago thought drones were going to be buzzing over our head delivering Amazon packages, and I don't know if that's ever going to happen. We might see, for example, in Tanzania, we might see hubs that drones will go to and from. But this idea of peer-to-peer drone delivery with drones hovering above all of us all the time and delivering right to your backyard, I don't think actually is ever going to happen. I'm going to come out and say that. It's a pretty bold prognostication, but I see it as being more like FedEx with the last mile being delivered traditionally, right? And in a hub and spoke system with drones, rather than the peer-to-peer decentralized way that everyone thought it was going to work before.
More questions? There, go ahead.
I just had a question about disasters. So have you looked at kind of disaster response or even recovery? And I think from an inequality perspective, recovery can be quite interesting. Hurricane Katrina has some interesting examples of communities that were right next to each other, and for various kind of infrastructural reasons, they recovered in a very different way. And the disaster kind of created an opportunity to see that very organically over time. So have you looked at kind of disaster response or recovery at all?
A little bit, yeah. africanDRONE and Unequal Scenes, definitely not. But in general, in the industry, yeah, I'm aware of some really innovative use. A lot of innovation coming out of the insurance industries. For example, Hurricane, is it Harvey was the one in Houston? It was called Harvey, right? Yeah. Insurance companies immediately were down there with drones because they wanted to know exactly what buildings were underwater where. And they had them up as soon as the NOTAM was lifted. That allowed drones to fly over that area. Because you have to realize also drones are very heavily regulated in the States, even though I said it's a permissive flying environment. If there's disaster relief operations going on, so like National Guard helicopters or something, there'll be a NOTAM notified, and then every drone operator is supposed to adhere to those NOTAMs, which might say don't fly over the Houston city area, and they'll give you coordinates or whatever. But once that was lifted, insurance companies were, bam, in there. And it's just a lot quicker. It's literally, I mean, this maybe is the takeaway, is like drones are awesome. They are revolutionary, and civic tech is growing in leaps and bounds, and that's going to impact your ability to be a productive and informed member of your society. They're very pro-democratic tools. However, they don't give you any more information than is already accessible. It's just they'll do it faster and cheaper. Does that make sense? So the insurance companies could have used helicopters, or they could have just walked up to each house, one after the other. But that takes a long time. And it's expensive. So, I mean, you asked about cities as well. Like, we can basically do everything that we can do with sensors mounted on drones. We can mount those sensors onto helicopters or balloons even. But drones can do it very quickly. They can be programmed, right, which is quite a unique feature now. Yeah, they just speed everything up. So yeah, I've seen some interesting stuff, for example, with disaster response in response to hurricanes, wind damage, earthquake and tornado damage around the world, not just in America. Fires, as you know, I know Danielle because she contacted me earlier about informal settlement fires in South Africa. So those shacks that we saw in Cape Town, they burn really, really well and really, really quickly. They're really packed together, and there's no fire hydrants, obviously, in an informal settlement. So the fire trucks have to, when they finally do get there, they have to try to spray their water into the center. Long story short, in Cape Town, you'll see fires almost every day, like plumes of smoke on the horizon almost every single day. And I hope to explore more closely with you how drones can help combat that problem, which I see as a very underreported, almost invisible killer in South Africa, at least.
One more question?
Or not.
What's the number one city you really would like to do an unequal scene photo in that you haven't done already?
Cool, thank you. It's an easy one. Well, it's a combo of Rio and Sao Paulo.
Costa Rica?
I don't know, you tell me. I haven't even looked at San Jose, but maybe. Yeah, Brazil, everyone thinks that photo that a guy named Tuca Vieira took is one of mine. Not everyone, that's very presumptuous, but I've often been asked to license that photo on email, like, hey, I love this photo, can you please license it to me? And I'm like, it's Tuca Vieira's photo. I'm sure you guys know the one I'm talking about, with the swimming pools coming down from the condo and then the slum right to the right of it. If I put it on the screen, you'd recognize it immediately, but he actually took that in 2004 from a helicopter. So that's 15 years old. I've actually, funny story, a little digression. I emailed Tuca Vieira and I asked him, if I come to Brazil, would you want to team up and do like a 15 years later kind of photo project? And he was psyched. So yeah, I'm hoping to go this year actually. Because I know a lot of people in Brazil through Unequal Scenes, because actually one of the images is hanging in a museum in Rio de Janeiro as well. The Museum of Tomorrow is what they call it. So I'm hoping to go there this year and then meet up with him and do some images there. But yeah, Brazil has an interesting president now as well. So we'll see how that works as well as far as access, but in general, yeah. I'm also interested, if you guys have ideas, let me know, because that's kind of how I do this project. People give me tips, I look at them on Google Earth, I figure out if it'll work, and then I go from there. So if your neighborhood or a place you visited seems really unequal, sounds like a horrible thing to solicit, but if you have an idea, send me an email.
Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, BSA, for hosting this event. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.